All right, well, welcome on to this Q&A. Again, want to welcome to this Q&A. So, I want to say, well, part of the question, I guess, came in, and that was a question about Basin, and someone goes to rabbinical courts, for the sake of conversion. So I want to make, one thing very clear. Basin has tremendous amount of responsibility. Certainly, converting, anyone, they're going to call it the way they see it. They're not, they're not going to rush necessarily into things unless there are um, other mitigating factors, right? Let's say, but they're going to call it the way they see it. So, some will call a person in every couple months, maybe every 4 months. I don't know, depending on where they're holding, and all that. But one thing to keep in mind, as we said before, they're the ones calling the shots. I mean, again, I'm not saying they should wait a year before contacting you or anything like that. Nonetheless, they have huge responsibility. Now, if they play games and other things, or there are other issues, obviously, as we mentioned many times, that's definitely, an issue. So some may be better in that sense. Some, God forbid, may be worse in that sense. I don't know. You know, you can have people that I don't, maybe want to test them, right? Part of it could be a test also. Say, well, they haven't got back to me, whatever. Okay, right? So you gotta call them. You gotta get in their face a little bit. You have to, show your presence without being obnoxious. Now, there's certain times, obviously, they're busy, right? This time of year on Passover time, they're busy, right? So, to think that, they're going to get back to you straight away, I think it's wishful thinking, but it doesn't mean, within reason. If they're around, they can contact you and whatever. Good. Could take them a few days, could take them a week, could take less. I mean, there's no general, I wouldn't say there's any general rule on that, but I've had people definitely say, well, it's kind of problematic because a person's interested in finishing and especially if they're prepared and all that. So like, why shouldn't it be a priority? Now, no one says it's not a priority. But a person has to understand this is, what they do, that they are not just, sitting and basting. I mean, there's other obligations, right, as well. So, some basins don't meet every day. Might meet every other day, it might meet a few times a week. It depends. It depends. And what a person needs in this process more than anything else, is patience, which I understand. There are people in this process for a long time, and sometimes things don't work out, the way it should. And whatever, it's sort of horror story. I don't really know so much, so much of the details, but a person's been in the process for a long time and I've had an issue, I guess, with the base din and sponsored rabbi and whatever, the person's somewhere in limbo. And that's kind of one of the worst things, in this world. Nobody wants to be in doubt, right? Being in doubt is, one of the worst things. It's, there are two things. One is all beginnings are hard, right? That's a general rule. I mean, and that was said thousands of years ago, so it's nothing, nothing new. Anyone's ever, let's say, you go from, let's say, grammar school to middle school, or middle school to high school, or you start a new job, or you move to a new neighborhood, or different things. So beginnings, certainly can be hard. Doesn't mean 100% they will, but in general, different circumstances, you meet different people, different situations, that makes sense. So that is, that's a general statement that, things, beginnings are hard. And other, statements, that the rabbis made in their infinite wisdom thousands of years ago was nobody wants to be in doubt. People like to have clarity, right? And there are things, within Torah law, within halacha, there are a lot of things. There are a lot of things that are black and white, right? That are pretty clear. There are other things that, we have difference of opinion. We have Ashkenazic tradition, we have Sephardic tradition. So difference of opinion, is okay because they're holding by what they need to hold by anyway, right? There are things that, okay, we don't know for sure. We have doubt. So if it's a Torah thing, we have, we have a general rule that if it's something in the Torah, if you have a doubt, we're stringent because you don't mess around with anything in the Torah. If it's rabbinical, you can be, you can be more lenient, depending what it is. But being in doubt and being this process, like people, I think people make the mistake and people think that the hardest part of the process, itself is what is actually finishing. So, but at the end of the day, why would I say it's not the hardest part, right? Getting to the process, yeah, I hear is difficulty. I think the harder part is, after. That once the person converts and now they're on their own, so to speak, that's when I think a person needs the most guidance. What do I do with this? And what do I do with that? And now it's all for real, right? So now keep in mind, a non-Jew can have, a Yetzirah, I can have an evil inclination for, while they're in the process, but person has to realize they're not obligated, right? In other words, if right up until conversion, a non-Jew didn't do anything, like nothing, they keep Shabbos, they eat kosher and all that, that's fine, right? That's 100% fine. Once they convert, they have to start keeping everything. So that's why a person is going to start keeping things depending where they're holding, right? Not going to do everything at once, obviously, but, you start taking things on, you start getting used to certain things, right? It gets easier. In a certain way, it's practice. Okay. I wouldn't tell anyone to start trying to do everything all at once, right at the end, so to speak. Everyone said, they go, get a cheeseburger. What's the problem? I said, if they're like just about ready to convert, you're going to tell them, to do that? He said, are they Jewish? I said, no. Did they convert yet? I said, no. So, almost whatever is permitted for them to do, they're allowed to do up until conversion. After conversion is a different story, right? So people say, well, I got an evil inclination now. What's it going to be like, when I convert? Now think about it. Right now, a person doesn't have an obligation to pray, doesn't have an obligation, to do other things. Okay. They want to do more, they want to do less, they feel like doing it, don't feel like doing it. Once conversion, that's a whole different ballgame, right? For a guy, he's got to pray 3 times a day. He's got to find, 10 people to pray with, and he's got to work it out, and whatever. A lot of things a person has to do. Judaism has no problem obligating people to do things, right? So you're gonna have all these obligations, and now it's for real. So Kaufman's law is make every single mistake now, before conversion, right? So that you make plenty of mistakes, that's okay, right? But to say if you understand where you made the mistake, right? Let's say person was doing, I don't know, go back to math a little bit. Person's doing, a word problem or any type of problem, whatever it is, within math, and you got it wrong, right? So now the question is, okay, what did you do wrong? Did you just, you didn't add everything up correctly? Did you miss a step? Sometimes you get partial credit because maybe you set it up partially right, but you missed something. So what happens? You go back and you look at all the steps, right? Did I do every last thing that I was supposed to do? Okay, word problems like this. I set this up like this. Okay, is that right? Let's say it's right. Then you get the next step. Is that right? Looks right. Then you get the third step and you say, wait a minute, maybe You missed something. Let's say, in that case you missed something, so that throws the whole thing off. Okay. Well, let's say you get all the steps right. Let's say there were 3 steps. 3 steps to the final answer. Now, if you set it up right, so very good. So now you know what A, B, and C is. Fine. What's the final answer? Now, a person can do all the right steps and get the wrong answer. Right? They can be sloppy. They just, they added wrong, they subtracted wrong, they multiplied wrong, right? I'm saying without calculators, right? Or whatever. So you do it in a way, where, okay, but you got the main thing, right? You got 90%. You got 90% over here, but you ended up, getting the wrong answer. Now, there's an interesting question just in general. We'll throw this out there that a person, who gets more credit, when it comes to, learning, more merit, let's say. Person who spends, a long time, analyzing things, and they come up with the wrong answer, right? But they delved into it in great depth. Or somebody, who got the right answer, but they didn't work so hard for it. Right? So the answer is, it's not necessarily about the right answer, it's about the effort you put in. Right? So the more effort a person puts in, obviously the greater the reward, even if you'd come up with the wrong answer. Now, obviously, you want to come up with the right answer. That makes sense. Right? You should want to come up, with the right answer. But if a person's putting in all this effort, tremendous amount of effort in, they put all this effort in, so that does something. That changes the person. That makes the person think. That makes the person, work. There are plenty of people out there that don't work. They don't want to work so hard. They want to say, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to do it? But they don't want to go through the details, right? And if you don't go through the details, you lose. Now, why do you lose? Because there's a plan. Right? There's an ultimate plan in learning, right? You break it down. What are they saying? Are they arguing? Are they not arguing? Right? What's the practical law? But you have to know what's in front of you very well, right? You have to know, whatever you're learning, doesn't matter, right? You have to, before you draw any conclusions, you have to say, okay, what's it saying? Or what's it not saying? Right? So if I know exactly, what it's saying, okay, maybe I'll look at it from this perspective, look at it from that perspective. But what does Torah do in general? It makes you tired. Why does it make you tired? Not because you don't sleep. It makes you tired because it's heavy on the brain. Makes you think, right? Makes you think of possibilities, right? There are a number of times, I've been learning something and I'm like, this person is an idiot. Like, why would he do like this and do that, right? But, as I was cracked over the head, it's not a question, he did it, right? This is what the person did. Very good or not so good. This is what he did. Okay. So now what are the ramifications? Are there any ramifications for what they did? Yeah. Right. That people get caught up in, myself included, and saying like, why would a person have said that? Or, why would they have acted in that way? So that's not really, the question. I mean, part of it could be part of it, but what's the main part? Why? What's the end result? The end result is the person did it. Okay. Are there ramifications? Are there liabilities? Are there obligations? Right? Whatever it may be. So some things are, I would say, more in depth. Some things less in depth, but at the end of the day, right? At the end of the day, you don't know what to do, right? So that's the difference in many ways, between men and women. Women just want to know what to do. Just tell me, okay, this is my obligation. Don't make me jump through hoops. Don't say, okay, opinion like this, opinion like that. We look at it like this, look at it like that. There are women that enjoy that. Give and take. I think certainly many, don't have the time and other things for that. So they want to know brass tacks. What am I, what am I supposed to do? For men, they obviously think differently. So, delving into it, they also want to know, bottom line, what am I supposed to do? Okay, but there's a lot more, give and take, right? There's a lot more, give and take, in that sense. But you got to get to the same point, right? And the same point is, I have to know what to do, right? And Torah's complex, right? As we always say. So I got to review, right? If a person learns they don't review, it's not worth anything. Why? Because you're never going to remember it. And Torah is not something that's just going to come to you like, like clockwork. Like, imagine, a person's been out of, math for a long time. I don't think they were halfway decent at math, very good. But they haven't, haven't used algebra in many years, whatever. So a person goes back to it, you don't forget. Yeah, you might forget some things, but it's there, right? It's something, um, it's something that I can fathom, something I can come back to. They say Torah, okay, everything we always say are building blocks, right? Even little things, right? They add up. A little bit of knowledge here, a little bit of knowledge there. Then you start asking different types of questions. That's progress. But a person's gonna say, but it's a yam, it's it's an ocean of material to go through. Yeah, it is. Right? It's not a shortage. Definitely not a shortage, of things to do, and things to know. Passover is a very good example. A lot of things you gotta know. Right? And a lot of things that, take time. Right? That, gonna take time to clean and to move and to this and to that. But while a person's in the middle of cleaning, whatever, you gotta remember what the purpose is, right? And why I'm doing it, etc. Yeah, well, my kids will say, "Hey, you're not Pharaoh, and we're not slaves." I'm like, right, keep cleaning, right? So, it's got to get done, and you got to find the time to do it and the energy to do it, and But at the end of the day, by the 14th to 15th of Nisan, it has to be done, right? You have to make a seder. There are things you have to do. That's it. It's got to, one way or the other. One way or the other has to get done. That's it. Sometimes easier, sometimes not. Go through all kinds of different things. But at the end of the day, you don't prepare. You might get something out of it, but you need to prepare. 100%, you need to prepare. Right? It's like, and every holiday, by the way, has its own spiritual influence. So if the holiday goes by and a person didn't get as much out of it, they'll say, okay, let me repent, let this, let that, okay, but it's gone. Right? Once the holiday's over, you get another year. You gotta wait another year. In other words, Shabbos comes in as a certain spiritual influence. Shabbos is over, it's gone. That Shabbos I can't get back. Right? That influence won't come back. Same thing by any holiday. So you gotta prepare. Right? And if you don't prepare, you don't go through the laws, you'll get something out of it. Like I say, you get nothing out of it. Right? You get something out of it, but you won't maximize it. You won't come close to maximizing it. Right? And whether it leaves, a sour taste in a person's mouth or not, I can't answer. Because again, it's there's a lot to do. It's not a shortage of things to do. So what do people do? They make lists. Okay, what do I have to check? When am I gonna do it? You gotta make realistic lists and things have to get done. Like that's it. It just no matter how you slice it. Yeah, it has to get done. But at the same time, you gotta remember what you're doing. And why you're doing it. And it takes preparation. Right? Even a person's cleaning, in theory, they could be, listening to something, also get inspiration while you're doing it. Right? Sometimes it's easy to do that, sometimes not, whatever. But in general, right? In general, these things have to be done. It's a cycle, right? There's a there's a cycle every year, every holiday when it comes up, right? So you got to review, and and you can say, yeah, we know the basic story, blah blah blah. That's true, right? We all know the basic story of the Gadol, right? Basic story of Jewish people coming out, yeah. But there's a tremendous amount of depth, Unbelievable amount of depth there. So again, what's one of there are three things we always say that the Gemara says are hard to acquire. One of them is the land of Israel. One of them is Olam Haba, the next world, having a portion of the world to come, and the third is Torah. Right? The Torah is like nothing else. The more you learn it, right, the more knowledge you have, the more you see there's a lot more out there. Like we're barely scratching the surface, so to speak. But we have to do it anyway, right? We have to learn, and we have to continue to learn, and that's why people, there are people that will buy every year. They'll buy a new Haggadah, and go through it. It's interesting. It's interesting, as we mentioned before, the Haggadah has probably more commentary on it than almost any other book, right? Almost any other Torah book, right? The only books probably have more commentary written on it are the Torah itself, and the prophets, and the Talmud, right? This comes probably third, and the irony is that we don't even know the authors. We're not sure, who the author is. The assumption is it's one of the rabbis of the Talmud, but it's not clear. Not clear exactly who, who it is. But there's not a shortage. People can speak about, you have four sons, right? You got a wise son, an evil son, a simple son, and a son that can't answer, doesn't know how to ask, right? So you have to explain things to him. So whatever, there's a lot of depth there. I mean, you look at the wise son, right? Let's say the wise son and the evil son say that they pretty much say the same thing. Like, what does this thing mean? What is this? Yeah, the wise son, you give an answer. The evil son, you don't give an answer. The wise son, you say you have to, you're not allowed to eat after the Paschal offering, right? The wicked son, you don't even give an answer. You blunt his teeth, right? Well, what's the difference? And not only that, why is the wicked son called? Why is the wise son called the wise son? What's the opposite? What's the opposite of wicked? It's righteous, right? Really, it should be the righteous son and the wicked son, right? But seemingly, you have two people who can say similar things, right? I'm just giving one idea. They can say similar things, but the outlook of both of them is very different. Where the wise son wants an answer, he's interested in an answer. The evil son's got an agenda, right? When a person has an agenda, they're not asking a question. They're just making a statement. And anytime we always say, someone makes a statement, there's no answer. We feel, no, you have to understand, it's this and that, Some people say, why did Judaism discriminate against women? Is there any question there? They don't ask a question. What's the answer? Oh. Or you can say, okay. Say, I think, let's say better. I think Judaism discriminates against pigs. Okay. I think they're not asking a question, right? They're making a statement. And they get flustered. They'll say, why did you just say, oh, or okay? Well, you didn't ask me anything. You made a statement. Say, if I were to ask you, what do you think, about Judaism and women? You think Judaism discriminates against women? Good. That's the question. You asked a question, okay. But before that, you didn't ask a question. Right, like, a couple of years ago, got locked in the bathroom, got, key jammed in. So I was telling someone, I couldn't even think of Torah, because I'm not allowed to think Torah in the bathroom. Right, the person said, oh, is that one of the rules? Now, that was a baiting question. I said, no, you don't understand what a bathroom is. No, you know what my answer was? Yeah, it's one of the rules. That's it. Diffuse the situation. Totally diffuse the situation. Yeah, that was it. I got upset about it. I had to think about it. That was it. Some people, though, will get baited. They'll say, no, what are you making fun? What are you this? What are you that? No, give a very simple answer. Yes. That's it. That's it. Yes, it's one of the rules. And, like, okay. Easily could have been baited. Easily could have gotten a much bigger discussion. Why do you say this thing? Why are you making fun? Why this? I could have. That's not what they wanted. I mean, maybe, right? So I gave a very simple answer, but we get caught up in these things, right? If someone makes a statement, who says I have to answer? They made a statement. right? The person says, I think, and this is that. Okay. Not telling you anything else. Aggravates people because you don't answer them. You're not baited, right? And sometimes that's all they want. They just want to see a reaction. It's like, oh, I bet this is okay. Yeah. Oh, then you sleep over because they're not asking anything, right? So, there are some people who feel that, they have to answer whatever someone says and it's negative. I get it, but, if they're not asking anything, I don't have to waste my time. I don't have to waste my time on that. All right, let me see their questions here. Someone asked, how is a testing conducted? They tell you what you know. No, they don't tell you what you know. They ask things. They want to see what you know. How they're going to ascertain. The basin is going to ascertain or try and get a feeling for what a person knows. For what a person knows in time. That's what they're going to do. They're going to try and see what level of knowledge that a person has. They may ask them some questions in the laws of Shabbos. They may ask them questions in kashrus. They may ask them other things. Yeah, I know of somebody, answered everything correctly, and then it was a woman, and then they started asking questions about sacrifices that she couldn't answer. And then started asking questions about purity and impurity that she couldn't answer. And a few other things. And why they do that? Why did they do that? They told her that, don't worry, shortly, you're going to the mikveh, you passed, 100%, flying colors. We just want you to know and, to understand you don't know everything. Right? I mean, they were very impressed or whatever. So you could tell me, well, if they're very impressed, why don't they just convert them? Okay. But they wanted to make a point. Now, you can argue whether they should have or not. It's a different issue. But they wanted to make a point. They wanted to make a point and say, that there are things you don't know. Don't think, even if you answer every question right, even if you get 115% extra, extra credit on the test, yeah? Yeah, extra credit. Very good. So even if they gave you extra credit, brother got 115 on the test, or who knows what. Yeah, that doesn't mean you know everything, right? You pass the test, you go to the mikveh. Very good. Yeah, that is very good. But that doesn't mean a person knows every last thing. And that's the point they wanted to make, not to break them. There wasn't a point to break them, but the point was to show them that this knowledge you have, you have a lot of knowledge. Yeah, that's great. And you're gonna make a great person, a great Jew. Okay, right? But we want to make sure you understand. That's not. They asked them a handful of questions. Okay, but they want to make sure they understood. They didn't understand. They don't know everything, right? That they don't know everything. They're they may ask. They're assuming you've gone through. If you've gone through a program and the program is what it should be, they will assume. They may ask, but they may assume. Did you go through this? Did you go through that? Did you go through the other thing? Right? They may have already asked it in a previous case, let's say in a previous meeting. They probably already know. They probably gone through blessings, they probably gone through kashrus, probably gone through the 13 principles of faith and the holidays and Shabbos, whatever. They probably assume that. They may ask it, but I don't know. I tend to doubt it, right? But they may ask it. But they want to see, a person has working knowledge, right? You have hot plates. You have a hot plate on Shabbos, and how are you supposed to use it? You take off soup, are you ever allowed to put it back? What if it's totally cooled off? What if you have no intention to put it back? What if you put it on the countertop? Did you have to hold it? There are a lot of things. But these are things you have to do every week. Blessings come up every day. These are things, regardless, they're not going to ask you such intricate questions. I mean, they may ask you some, but they want to see you have a working a working knowledge, right, of blessings. What's blessing over strawberry, rice cakes, yeah, other things, what a papaya, yeah. They're not going to ask you, someone, I understood they made me look very good. They asked, Basin asked them a certain, I forget what it was, about a certain anomaly I think it was a fruit. And this person like spit back all this information, about what's considered fruit of the tree and fruit of the ground and and why it's like that and blah blah blah. And like they didn't ask that. They didn't ask that question, but they answered because there's no question. Let's say, a strawberry. Strawberry grows on a bush, right? It grows on a bush. Okay. So it's far off the ground. The blessing should be Braypriya 8, right? That grows from a tree, but it's not really a tree. They look at it as coming from the ground, whatever. So the person went through this whole thing because, I went through it. So when they spit back the information, I mean, they got the right answer. They got the right answer, but they went further with the answers explaining, why that was, right? So the basin asked them, they're like, well, why do you know that? Like, where'd you get that information from? So what do you mean? Took Rabbi Kaufman's class, that's what, went through it, and, they knew the information. Well, that maybe looked very good. Okay, right? But again, they're not going to ask you in depth like that. They're going to ask you, what's the blessing? Right? Right? What's the blessing of a rice cake? Rice cake's another interesting thing because it's rice, but it's puffed. It's gun puffed, right? Heated. So rice is normally mizono. It's very good. Yeah, but if it's gun puffed or whatever, so many say that it should be adama. It goes down a level. It's not the same form as it was before. Okay, so they could ask you, on that. Well, you say break adama. That's could be the right answer. Some will say mizonos. They say, well, is there any other blessing you can make on this? Now, if a person knows and they memorize what the blessing is, okay. Now they may remember why is it like that. They may not. And the basis not going to penalize them if they don't know, right? But as long as they, they got the right answer, the important thing is to understand why it's like that, right? We're not going to ask that. There are some rabbinical courts that are more in depth, that will have actually a written test, and there are some that are extremely thorough. Okay, very good. But they want to see you have a working on. They're not going to say they're not going to say, okay, you want to convert. A person probably made a personal statement why they want to convert. Very good. Yeah, but so they know their information. They know where they're holding. So they're the ones asking the questions. I can't imagine. I don't think it's happened. Even maybe if it happened, it's like, I would say it's not very common, right? They're not going to ask you, okay, tell me what you know. Like, I can't imagine someone's going to ask that, right? They'll ask you specific questions, and even if they would, let's say once in a blue moon, someone will get this question. Okay, so what do you know? Well, I learned the laws of blessings. Well, I learned the laws of kashrus. Well, I went through this. I went through that. Yeah, that's not going to be good enough for them. They're going to say, okay, you went through it. So, they're not going to leave it open. They're not going to leave it open. The person's going to have to sit there and think, oh, okay. Well, the blessing over squash is this, and the blessing over this is this, and I understand this because of this. They're not going to make you think about it and say, okay, you come up with a question, you come up with something, and tell us why. They could do that. I don't think they're going to do that. They're going to put someone necessarily on the spot like that. They'll ask them general questions. They'll ask them, a kashrus question. They'll ask them a Shabbos question. I want to see if there's working knowledge of it, if they understand, why it's forbidden or not forbidden. They may ask you a few questions. Okay, I don't know. Some, like I said, some are more in depth, some are less in depth. But what do they want to see? What's the most important thing? The most important thing is they want to see you have working knowledge. You know how to use hot plate. Right? Say, are you allowed to cook on Shabbos? Say no. Okay. So what are you supposed to do? So, how do you eat hot food on Shabbos? Yeah, they could ask you that. Yeah, so you have a hot plate, but it's got to be fully cooked or mostly cooked, and whatever. There are laws governing that. Okay, so that they want to see. That they want to. So let's say better. They want to hear. They want to hear you have working knowledge of these things. Right? Now, could they not ask any questions about that? Could. They could ask anything. They could say, is there any problem brushing your teeth on Shabbos? Right? They could ask that. Right? It's toothpaste, you got a problem because it's smearing. So, you can say some people don't brush their teeth at all. Or what some people do, some people say that's gross, okay. Or use liquid toothpaste. Use liquid toothpaste with a toothbrush. That's not a problem. It's not smearing. Right? Because again, it's a liquid. Right? It's a liquid. It's not a paste. Right? So they could ask you, is there any problem brushing your teeth on Shabbos? Is there any problem making a snowman on Shabbos? Can I ask you that? I mean, whatever. A lot of different things. Right? A lot of different things. In most cases, I'm not going to say every because then someone's going to say, see, there was a case like this and you were wrong. Okay. I'm not saying every single case, but in most cases, certainly that I've been, a part of or aware of, in most cases, they're not asking you to tell information. They're going to ask you the question. They may ask other information, maybe about family and extended family and different things like that. Okay. And they want, to, you to explain like relationships with them or who knows what. Right. But this is very specific. They're going to ask very specific questions. Now, again, some will be more in depth, some will be less in depth. Right. But if a person's gone through the coursework and, they've been doing this for however long, very good. They want to see, a person's knowledge. That's what that's what they want to see. And if they feel that the person's knowledge is weak, yes. That the knowledge is weaker. Okay. Right? 100%. That's what you have to do. I had somebody I work with, their knowledge was weaker in a certain thing. Right? Their knowledge was weaker. Okay. So they made them focus on the laws of Shabbos. I helped them through that. It depends. Depends what, if the base then feels that a person's weaker, let's say, in certain things, they'll tell them, okay, you should focus on this more. You should focus on this more. So I had this a few times where actually in both cases, it was the laws of Shabbos that they had to refocus on. But everything else they seem to be happy with. So, okay. Right? It depends on the person. Right? It depends on the person. Now, somebody mentions, want to point this out. Someone mentions that person's amazed that people complete this process in 2 years. 2 years is a minimal. Right? A rabbinical court wants to see you in a community, at least for a year. Go through the cycle of all the holidays and all that. Right? But can it be done in 2 years? It can't be. If for sure, if it sure can be. Will it take longer? Maybe a person has to move. Maybe there are other factors involved, but it certainly could be. Right? People ask me the question, how long does it take? So I tell them a minimum of 2 years. Minimum of 2 years. If it takes 2 years, good. Right? Like, that's a minimum amount. It can be done though. If a person has the knowledge, they live in a community, why not? Well, if they already live in a community, they have the knowledge, you should be able to, right? Unless there are other questions. Someone says, okay, Rabbi asked to tell me what you know. That's weird. It's a weird thing to say, right? So what would be the simple answer? If someone were to ask you this question, okay, someone going to ask the question, very good, right? Someone going to ask the question, so what would you answer? So, now answer what you know. Very simple. I went to the laws of blessings. Blessings I know. Kashrus I know. Shabbos I know. Right? I've read this book, I've gone through these classes, whatever. Right? Then they might ask you specific questions. Right? So you tell me, okay, they were put on the spot like that. So that would be the answer. Pray, you know how to pray. Hebrew, you know how to read. Synagogue, you go to. Right? That's the gamut of things you have to know. Again, kashrus, prayer, 13 principles of faith, all the holidays, Shabbos, blessings, right? Those are things you have to know, right? So then, okay, tell me what you know. So my answer would be, this is what I've gone through. I've gone through kashrus. Yeah, I keep a kosher home. I've gone through Shabbos. I've gone through this. They may follow up and say, okay, okay. Then they may start asking questions. Or they could tell you in general, okay, Shabbos. Yeah, tell me something about Shabbos. They could say that, right? I would think they would ask the question, but let's say, tell me something about Shabbos. Yeah, say, there are a lot of things you can say about Shabbos. You don't know how to cook on Shabbos, can't carry if you don't have an Eruv, whatever. Well, yeah, there are a lot of laws. Can't write, can't drive a car, you can't do this, you can't do that, right? They may ask you specific questions on that. Can't imagine it's going to be open-ended. Where they say, okay, just tell me what you know about this or about that, about the other thing. I mean, I wouldn't say it's totally a fair question because there are tremendous amount of laws over here. Like, a person can say, okay, be specific. Like, what do you want to know? Like, blessings I learned, kashrus I learned, Shabbos I learned. So, oh, you learned so what'd you learn about? They can ask you, tell me certain topics you learned about. Could ask that. Then they may follow up and ask you specific questions. Could do that. Right, could do that. I would think, though, that, they'd be the ones asking the questions and not you having to come up with certain things that you learned about. Do I set up a curriculum to know what I'm going to say? You don't have to set up a curriculum. All you have to tell them is what I've gone through. Right? I've gone through kashrus. I've gone through prayer. I've gone through this. And you can tell them along the way. Prayer, I know how to pray, I know how to read. I go to synagogue, I know when to stand and to bow and to this and to that. You can say basic things about any of these topics. Now, they could ask you, based on what you said, they could have follow-up questions. Oh, so you learned about blessings, So you tell them, what you learn about blessings, right? So you say, one of the things we learned about is topic about Iker and Tafel, right? Something that is primary, something that is subordinate. So I go, give me an example, right? They can follow up on this. Oh, you learned that, so tell me a little bit about it. Just want to see if you have that knowledge. And then they may follow up and say, okay, very good. Corned beef and cabbage, what's the blessing? Spaghetti and meatballs. Is it one entity? Is it two entities? They can follow up with that. But if they would ask, so in this case, right? We'll just beat this down for a second. In this case, if they ask, if they ask the question, open-ended question, it's an open-ended question. What did you learn? So you can tell them, yeah, you can tell them, what you learned, what the curriculum was, that you learned, what you went through. Now the question is going to be, they may follow up and say, okay, tell me some certain things you learned about. They can do that. Right? My experience is they don't normally do that. They'll ask you specific questions. Yeah. Because they're assuming you've gone through what you need to go through. They're not going to assume, you didn't go through Shabbos. That's pretty important. Or you didn't go through blessings, or you didn't go through other things. They're going to assume, you probably learned about this. Now, they may ask. They certainly may ask. Right? They certainly may ask. Am I my mamad? Yes. In this case, it's a siren. We got a warning, but there's no siren. But I guess it's a siren in Jerusalem. So the whole thing seemingly is somewhat over because I heard explosions there, but I don't know. See what happened there. See if, God forbid, anyone got hurt. how do you test myself? The only way to test yourself is review. It's the only way. It's one of the things people have a knock, against what I do. I don't give tests. I should. I probably should. Keep people honest, but I don't. The only way you're going to know this material is by living it and going through it, right? You sit down to eat, right? You got spaghetti and meatballs, you got a drink, you got a side dish. Okay, so now you got to determine what the blessing is. And now if you have any doubts or whatever, good. So you got to go back and review, right? But at the end of the day, that's the only way to do it. The only way to do it is live it, right? And constantly review all these things. What's the blessing over this? What's the blessing over that? Why do I make the blessing like that? What's the and tuffle? Whatever, you have to keep going through it. But if you're living it, you don't have to necessarily review it unless you don't know what you're doing, right? Let's say you got corned beef and cabbage. Very good. Yeah. So now your question is, what's the blessing? Yeah. What's the blessing I make? Do I make two blessings? Do I make one blessing? Right? But what does this come under? What category? Primary and subordinate. And now, if you're not sure how it works, you go back to those classes, right? That's what you do. But if you're living it, hopefully you make a mistake, you'll know what the mistake is, right? You'll definitely know, what the mistake is. And once you know what the mistake is, you won't make the same mistake, right? Hopefully you won't make the same mistake again. Yeah, that is, But again, I don't, maybe I should give tests, but I don't, right? So that's the only way. You have to live it. And and you have to constantly review. There is no, I don't have an easier way. I don't have an easier way, but you have to know how it works. You have to know, the most important thing, even if you get the wrong answer, the most important thing is know how these principles work. Right? Once you know how the principle works, you remember how the principle works, then you understand what you're supposed to do. Hopefully, if you don't understand how the principle works, you go back and review it. Right? I don't have an easier way of doing that. So I would say if you're making blessings or keeping Shabbos or doing any of these other things, so you have to know: am I doing the right thing or not doing the right thing? Is this permissible or not permissible? That's the test itself, right there. Right? That is the test itself, right there. But you say not every time you're thinking about these things. Okay. But if you know or potentially know there's a mistake or there's an issue, right? So then, right, then right? Then you would know. Should someone ask, do you have to have this before or after conversion? I would say after conversion. Some say you can put them up before conversion. It's probably better after conversion. Should we bring the syllabus to show them? You can, 100%. 100%. You can definitely show it to them. They may ask for it. They may ask for the coursework, right? Just what you did, what you went through, right? Just to keep me honest, or keep yourself honest, so to speak. They may do that, right? But if the basin knows my work, then that's not going to really be it's not going to be a problem, right? They're not going to ask that. They already know, but. If the base thing, let's say, doesn't know my work, okay, they'll say, okay, so what'd you learn? What'd you do? Right? And they'll speak to me also, most likely. So yeah, within a few minutes, they won't have any other questions. I'll say this is what I went through. So test them, see what they know. See what they're proficient in. But yeah, could you bring them syllabus here? Or they could ask you in general. What'd you go through? So you tell them. Covered everything. Blessings, kashrus, 13 principles of faith, all the holidays, prayer, whatever. Yeah. And they want to see, by the way, when it comes to Hebrew, their most important thing is they want to see how a person reads Hebrew. All right. They don't care if you speak Hebrew like an Israeli. That they're not that they're not interested in. No casualties, good. In general, they just want to see you can follow prayer service. They just want to see that you can read from a prayer book, or how to bench, how to say grace after meal. Right now, sometimes people will read really, really slow. And they want them to be more proficient. They want to be able to, to read it quicker. Okay, so, that may take some time. But again, speaking like an Israeli, they're not going to care. That's the most important thing about learning, learning Hebrew. So you say begin at the beginning. You start from the beginning. I mean, you just start from whatever you learned. You just start, right? What's primary and subordinate food again? You're eating a stuffed pepper. What's primary? You eat it for the pepper. You eat it from the rice inside, right? Or you have one entity, right? Cholent, right? It can be one entity, right? Let's say you cut up everything very, very, very small, right? Potatoes, meat, barley, I don't know, whatever else you have in there, right? You have all these other spices, which really doesn't matter, right? So let's say it's all one entity. If I got barley, I have to make a mazonos. Yeah, but what if I have potatoes that are cut up stronger, that are bigger, right? So then I have to make adamo, right? I don't eat it on one forkful, right? So again, that's what it is. So you have to go back and review what that means. What? Those are just a couple of examples. What are they eating minestrone soup? Yeah. So what's the blessing? Carrots, potatoes. What if you had matzo balls in there? Even better. What if you had matzo balls in there? Minestrone soup, most things are a double. Yeah, so you make a double. What if I have matzo balls? If I have matzo balls in there, you got to make them mazonos, right? I'd have to make them mazonos. Well, what if I eat, right? What if I eat the matzo balls? I don't eat them by themselves. I like eating the matzo balls with the beans or whatever else is in there, right? Beans, carrots, whatever. I never eat it by itself. Did I make a mazonos? No. If I would eat it by itself, that's a different issue, right? So those are some of the questions. Those are some of the questions. So how many blessings? Yeah. One second. Why are we speaking of the Beit Dumim, the Beit Dinim? Because someone asked. That's why we're speaking about it. Someone asked about what goes on in Beis Din, right? What goes on in the rabbinical court? What they ask, what they may not ask, right? How to prepare for it? That was the question. So that's what I answered. At the end of the course, will you tell us if we're ready? I'll determine. Yeah. Yeah. And it depends also how much, a person is living in. If not, if they're keeping less things of Shabbos, let's say, they, basically what I would do is I would set up a call and grill people. And just see. If they're ready. They can answer most of the questions. I'm not gonna make them so hard, but if they can answer most of the questions and they have clarity, then they should be ready, right? But yeah, that will, that I'll determine. It may depend on also how long people have been keeping things, how much they've really put into practice, and and if they have doubts on certain things, but whatever, that'll be my job to ascertain. I'm not going to send out a 50, 100-page questions and see what you get right. I could do that. In theory, I could do that. It might save time, but I know someone has, I don't know, 700 questions more. Sent out. It's pretty thorough. Extremely thorough. And what they have to know, and whatever. It basically grills them. I don't do that, right? Should I do that? Could, probably should, but I don't. Right? But a person, people are old enough; they have to do it on their own. Not my job to. That's not my job to do that per se. They have to test themselves. How's the best way? That's the question. How's the best way a person going to get tested? Live it. That's the best way, right? And see if you make mistakes, and see if you have questions, and then go back and see. Oh, I didn't really know this so well, right? That's the best way to test the person, right? Especially when it comes to Shabbos and let's say blessings. I mean, kashrus things will come up, but those are the two best things. You sit down and eat. Okay, what do I do? What blessing do I make? I'm eating. I'm eating. Let's say I have meatballs, right, which be a shakol, and now I take a drink of soda. Yeah, do the meatballs cover the soda? Right. So what's the general rule? General rule is a solid will cover a liquid won't cover a solid. Right? That's the general rule. If you made a shako, let's say a shako on soda, right? Probably unhealthy and kill you, and then you go eat meatballs, right? Same blessing, the shako, very good. Do I have to make a blessing now on the meatballs? Yes. So these are things you have to know, right? And the only way you're going to know it is to do it. And if you have a doubt and you make a mistake, or potentially make a mistake, or you're not sure, then you know. That's how you know. It's better than any test. It's living it, right? Definitely better than any test. How can we know? I just told you. Now someone says, I'm telling us to do less, don't cover. I didn't say that. I said depends where a person's holding. Some people will do more, some people will do less, but at the end of the day, before a person converts, you got to be doing. You can't just not be doing and say, well, I'm not going to do it right. I made very clear, at least I thought I made very clear, that right before conversion, does the person have to do anything? That's what we start out with. Does the person have to do anything before conversion? No. Technically, no. But how are you going to know how to do anything if you don't? If you don't practice, that was the point. I'm not saying don't do anything, right? It depends where a person's holding. Can a person do everything all at once? No. Is it going to take step by step? Yes. It's going to take time, right? No one's going to be able to do everything all at once. It drive yourself crazy. You won't be able to do it, right? My point, again, maybe I didn't make it clear enough. My point was that right before conversion, is a person a non-Jew? Are they obligated to any of these things? No. Right? So some people would say, don't dress like a Jew, don't do these things until right before conversion. Now I would say that's pretty absurd. Right? Dressing, okay, maybe. Right? Maybe so you don't look like a Jew, whatever, until after conversion. Okay, I can hear that to a point. Yeah. But if you don't start practicing at whatever level, whenever it is, how are you going to know what to do? How in the world are you going to know what to do if you don't? Right? So, for someone to say, well, don't start practicing and being like a Jew until right before conversion. Well, what are you supposed to do about Shabbos? How in the world are you supposed to know anything about Shabbos if you don't observe it? I mean, you have to do something to break it, obviously. You have to do something on purpose to break it, okay. But how are you going to know the intricacies of Shabbos if you don't practice it? Now, some people practice more of it. Some people practice less of it before conversion. Whatever it is, at some point, right before a person converts, you have to keep everything. You have to keep kashrus. You have to keep all the laws of kashrus and separate dishes and separate pots and all this. Yeah, it has to be done at some point. When? Depends on the person. Depends on the person. But I was saying, technically speaking, does a non-Jew have to do anything right before conversion? In Shabbos, kashrus, blessings, anything? No, doesn't do anything. But I would tell people to do that. I tell people start keeping things at some level, as time goes on, you keep more things, and then right before conversion, you'll be ready. I wouldn't tell someone don't do anything right before conversion, you'll never know how to do anything. And basically start asking all kinds of questions, you won't know what to answer. You won't know what to answer. Right? So it's not about, well, do a little bit of this, don't do a little bit of that. You have to keep it to a certain extent. Obviously, you have to keep it, but if you don't put it into practice, you're never going to know what to do. Right? But again, the whole point is that right before, during the process of conversion, from the very beginning, a person decided to convert, they move to a community, very good, up until they go to the mikveh and convert. Yeah, up until that point, they don't have to keep anything. That was my point. They don't have to keep anything according to the Torah. Nothing. Whatever applies to them according to the Noahide laws. Right? They can eat treif. They can do whatever they want. That's permissible for a Noahide. But my point was that, so that's a technical thing. You're not obligated. What, after conversion, you're obligated. Very good. So you're obligated exactly like a Jew. So if you're obligated like a Jew, how in the world you're not going to start keeping things before that? Now you're going to tell me when before that? I don't know. It depends when you want to do it. Depends how a person wants to do it. Some people are going to start doing things from the very beginning. They'll make mistakes, okay. But they'll start doing something. And eventually they'll start taking on more things at some point. But, as we said, you're not going to be able to take on everything all at once. You won't be able to do it. Right? So you take it step by step. Some people do more of this. Some people do less of this. Okay, but at the end of the day, you're going to be ready. And the only way to be ready is to put it in action. That's it. That's the only way. If you don't put it in action, you'll never know what to do. Because then you won't make mistakes. You won't do anything. Right? So it has to be put in action. Right? 100% it has to be put in action. So they say, but I can't keep Shabbos like a Jew. Very good. So do something on purpose to break it. You keep other aspects of Shabbos, that's not a problem. Right? But have the conversion. You have to keep everything. So if you don't know what you're doing before that, there's going to be no point to convert. Because you never practice it. That's one of the things they're going to ask you. How long have you been keeping Shabbos? You say 2 weeks. 2 weeks. But I learned all the laws. But I've only really started keeping it for 2 weeks. I don't think they're going to be impressed by that. They're not going to be impressed by that. They want to keep Shabbos longer, obviously. Why? So you know what you're doing. You can say, but I learned all the laws. It's not the same. Learning it and doing something practical is not the same. Right? You can read all the books, but if you never practiced it, you get some knowledge from it, right? The example we always give is, imagine somebody, it's before YouTube, they learned how to swim. They're learning how to swim, right? And by learning how to swim, they only read books. No YouTube. Now, you take the person, throw them in the deep end of a pool. What's going to happen? By the time they remember what they're supposed to do in swimming, they're already at the bottom of the pool. Right? So book smart can only go so far, but you have to see it in action. If you don't see it in action, the book smart's not, it's not going to totally help you. Right? But it has to be where someone's putting it into action. Because if you're not putting it into action, you won't know what to do. I'm not cursing anyone. You won't know what to do. Right? You have to see it. You have to practice it. Obviously, it's better. The London Basin makes people live with Jewish families, with Orthodox families for a certain amount of time. Sometimes it's not so practical to do that, whatever. Why do they do that? So a person can see hands-on what you're supposed to do. You see hands-on. Not every, most rabbinical courts do not make you do that. Right? But how else are you going to know what to do? Right? There's a whole thing about not inviting, not being allowed to invite a non-Jew, for a festive meal. Passover, for Passover Seder, this and that, based on certain technicalities. Yeah. Now, at the same time, if you want to say it's forbidden, right, there are ways around, there are some ways around it, right? But at the end of the day, if they're in the process of conversion, how are they going to know how to keep Passover Seder if they never went to a Seder? How are they going to know what to do? They'll say, they watch on YouTube. They'll this, so that. It's not the same. It's totally not the same as seeing it. Right? There are other technical issues with it, but that's not the point. Point is seeing is believing. You see what people do. Yeah, then you ask questions like, why do it this way, not that way, why not? That's how you learn. That's how you learn. But, it's got to be practical. That is the best way. And if you don't make it practical, it's going to be very hard to do. It's all theory. Right? It's all theory, right? Give another example. Here in Israel, to get a learner's permit, you have to take a test, multiple choice test. Now, when I got my license in the States, to get a permit was a joke. You had to get like 7 out of 10, back in the day. And if you didn't get like 10 out of 10 or 9 out of 10, you're like an idiot because the questions were so easy. Here, it's very hard. You have to get 26 out of 30. right? And there are confusing questions. There are a lot of confusing questions. They'll say, okay, they'll show you a picture, car coming this way, car coming this way, and someone coming the other way who's got the right of way, right? So they say the one's got the biggest car. No, right? So, you have to know these things. You have to do like memorize these things, but it's hard, right? So good. So let's say you pass that test. You can't start driving lessons without passing that test. Okay. Right. So you finally pass the test. Let's say it takes a few times. Okay. You finally pass the test. You get behind the wheel. Did any of these questions that you answered, some of them will help you in driving. Some of them. Yeah. Some are more obvious than others. Okay. But there are going to be a lot of questions that were there that have no relevance. They have no relevance to help you drive at all. Right. So I remember when I get my license and whatever, renew it, and my otherwise expiring, so I take some lessons, whatever. And the driver instructor says, "Listen, I know you know how to drive, but if you do not, drive like the book, you won't pass." So I said, "Nobody drives like the book. That's why people drive like maniacs here." I said, "Nobody drives like the book." So he said, "Sir, I'm telling you, if you don't drive like the book, you will fail." It's a joke because nobody drives like that. No one drives exactly like that, whatever. But that's what you have to do, right? But again, even if you go through like these they have like, I don't know, 3,000, 4,000 questions to go through for this test, for this, what do you call it, to get your permit, right? To get your permit. Again, you look at some of them are obvious. Some of them are, definitely obvious. Maybe a lot of them are obvious. But there are other things that, they're not so obvious. And they don't have as much relevance either. They'll tell you certain things like you have to memorize all these signs. Yeah, like I don't know, whatever. A stop sign, obviously, but other types of signs. They ask a handful of questions maybe about some signs, but like, some of them more practical, some of them less practical, right? But where's the more practical thing going to happen when you get behind the wheel? That's what's going to happen. It's not all the theory behind it. But you have to understand some of the theory in order to do it. Very good. Right? I'll give one example. They have a lot of roundabouts, right? Right. So now, if you're coming down a roundabout, how are you allowed to enter the roundabout? I guess some driving theory here. How are you supposed to go around the roundabout? You don't see anyone in, right? You don't see someone coming around. To see someone coming around, you have to stop. You have to yield, right? You have to yield. Now, what do some people do? They just keep going. Someone's coming around and they just go through. But what's the law? Literally, what's the law? You got to stop. If someone's already gone through, you can't go. You have to wait. Right? That's the law. Okay. Right? And then if you're coming through, what do if you let's say you make a turn, where do you end up when you make the turn? Right? You make a left turn. You want to end up in the middle, right? You don't want to end up on the left lane when you make a left turn. You want to end up in whatever. There's certain things, right? Certain things more obvious, but you're not going to get it until you're there, until you're behind the wheel. Once you're behind the wheel, okay. So now you understand, right? Now you understand. But there are people do, I can't even tell you how many times. Yeah, I come to a roundabout where I live. There's a lot of roundabouts. Yeah, you come to, or other places, and it's busy, there's traffic, there's a lot of traffic, let's say. Okay. You don't have a right to go in if someone's coming around. You shouldn't go in because you can hit them. They have the right of way. You don't have the right of way. I mean, you can think you have the right of way, but you don't. I've seen people do this, and it's just, it's incredulous to me. They don't care. They just say, okay, I'm coming straight. I have the right of way. No, that's the way people drive here. So it's I'm just telling one of my kids that started driving. One of my other kids at the car, that two of my kids were splitting. So whatever, they're getting used to driving and whatever. And they're like, yeah, they said it's nerve-wracking. They go somewhere. It's like, how am I supposed to cut over? I said, you learn these things. It becomes like second nature. You got to look. You got to look. You got to look. And like. Sometimes on these streets people can drive pretty fast, so you got to be careful. But by the book. Nobody drives by the book. Nobody. Yeah. It's one of the only countries, by the way, just on this topic, one of the few countries in the world that will tell you at the end of the week how many car crashes there were and how many accidents. And God forbid how many people killed. One of the worst places to drive. Like there's no question. People say if you can drive in New York, you can drive anywhere. People say here, if you can drive here, you can drive anywhere. So when I first got my car, I was talking to one of my kids. I was somewhere. I said, I want to see how long it takes for someone to cut me off. So I saw it, the corner of my eye. I saw someone coming, cut over 3 lanes in order to cut me off. I was like, okay, now I know I'm here. Now, now I'm ready. That's what it is, right? But drive by the book. You can drive in theory, right? You know all the theory stuff, but if you don't get behind the wheel, you don't know what to do, right? It's the same thing. Same thing over here. If you don't practice, you don't live it, you won't do it. Someone asked, is the Muslim cousin with the Jewish people? Yes. We are cousins. They don't like it so much. I could understand why, but we are cousins, 100%. Right? Ishmael and Yitzhak are half brothers. Right? Different mothers, same father. Yeah, so they're cousins. Yeah, we don't, they don't like it so much. They don't want to get along, they just want to kill us. But we are cousins, yes. 100%. How can it be a sin for the Noahites to be proud when it's not obvious? Why? There are people, proud means to be, what's the word? Hubris, to be conceited. Now, is being conceited something that's obvious according to the Torah? For non-Jews. Now you're making an assumption, how can it be a sin? If it's obvious, right? Anything for the Noahites, if it's something obvious according to the Torah, then it's forbidden for non-Jews. Right? Now you'll tell me, anybody will tell me, there are a lot of conceited people out there. I've met a number of them. Yeah, there are people that are conceited. Okay. Right now, if you were to ask them, or ask other people, you don't even have to ask them. Is being stuck up in a snob and thinking you're better than someone else just based on pedigree, let's say, is that a good thing? Is that okay? Now, some people will say yes. Some people say we're better than them. We have better pedigree, right? Sherman certainly said that. Oil barons certainly said that, right? Bush Sr., and James Baker and all these guys that were oil barons, they belonged to country clubs, wouldn't allow blacks or Jews. Yeah, especially Jews. Right? So that's pretty obvious. Yeah, so they think they're better. They think, no Jews allowed, no blacks allowed. Okay. It's their choice. But now, if you pin them down, well, Bush is dead. Senior is dead. I know Baker's still alive. Either way, right? Either way, he'd ask them, why do you think that? They're like, what do you mean? We're more important. They'll give you any reason. Doesn't have to make sense, right? Certainly doesn't have to make any sense, right? But they can give you a quote unquote a valid reason. Why that's okay. So, but if you would ask people in general, take a survey, right? Family Feud, top 100 survey, right? Top 5 answers. Yeah. Or the top 2 answers, yes or no. Is it okay for someone, to be stuck up and think they're better than someone else based on race? Or based on the amount of money they have in their bank account, based on how many times they're quoted in the newspaper, based on, I don't know, you can have a whole list here, right? You can have a whole list of things. Now, some people may say, yes, I have a right to be stuck up and think I'm better than this person because of my pedigree, because of my wealth, because of my brain power. I can think of a lot of things a person could say. Now, let's ask the question again. How can that be a sin? If a person is proud. Think about it. If you'd ask someone based on the amount of money they have in their bank account, does that make them better than someone else? Yeah. Now, if you were to ask people, let's say they don't have a lot of money, it doesn't matter. Would you say that a person has a right to say they're better because they have more money? Now, they would probably say no, right? That's what I would think, right? That a lot of people would probably say no. It doesn't give you the right to say you're better based on the amount of money in your bank account or what your pedigree is or where you came from. Person's going to say, oh, I grew up in England or I grew up in France or whatever. So we're so much better than the Americans, and they'll give you any number of reasons why. Now ask the question, is that a good thing to do? Is that the right thing to do, to be stuck up? Now, some of the French, I'm not saying everybody, some of the French are tremendously stuck up. Yes. It's a known thing. Yeah. Now they'll say we're not, and it's our culture, and it's there. Okay, whatever. Right? But if someone's stuck up in their own culture, they think they're better than someone else. Answer the question. Is that a good thing? Are people going to see that's a good thing? I don't think so. Can't imagine. Right? So now, back to the question. How can it be a sin? Why should it be a sin? You're allowed to think you're better based on your bank account? That makes sense logically? According to the Torah? I grew up in Boston, right? Everybody knows. I grew up in Boston. So all Boston sports teams are better than everybody else in general. Couldn't I say that? Certainly better than Cleveland. What's Cleveland ever won? Right? What's Cleveland ever won in the world? Detroit, what have they ever won in the world? Okay, they won, a few championships back in the 80s. Very good. And since then, they haven't done very much. Football team wasn't so bad over the last few years, but they haven't done anything, right? So we got 18 championships. Boston Celtics, we got, 5 Super Bowls, 6 Super Bowls. New England Patriots. Doesn't that make us better? Everyone hates New England. Everyone hates Boston. That's the way it is in sports. Why? Because they're good. And usually every year they're good. They're contending for championships, usually. Even the Red Sox. Yeah, I don't follow hockey, so it doesn't matter, right? But even the Red Sox, right? Now, so someone like me could be stuck up and say, oh, come on. Any of these other cities that haven't done anything in sports in the last 20 years, 25 years. Of course we're better than them. Right? But if I would have a chip on my shoulder saying that, and saying, I'm better than you because I came from Boston and our sports teams are better. So you're just like a little peon that deserves to be squashed. Would that be the right thing to say? Really? That would be the right thing to say? The racist thing to say. Not racist, but it's whatever. You're saying you're better based on something else. It doesn't matter. Right? It's because you have money, that makes you better than someone else. It'll make you better. Right? Now, should the Noahide know better than that? Sure. 100% they should know better. Right? They should know better. Because being conceited is bad. Being conceited, the Oracle to think of the ways of the righteous says it's the base of all bad character traits. The base of all bad character traits. So how can it not be forbidden for a Noahide? Yeah, how can it not be, how can it not be better? St. Louis Cardinals have won more championships than the Cubs. Great. Yeah. Cubs hadn't won since, the only longest drought besides the Red Sox were the Cubs. Right? 1 year difference. Right? So I told somebody when the Red Sox finally won the World Series, for the first time. I told someone also, his father grew up in Boston, so I said, Mashiach's coming. If the Red Sox won the championship, Mashiach's coming. Messiah's coming. So a few days later, it's okay, where's the Messiah? This kid asked me. So I said, come on, it took Boston 87 years, 86 years to win. Come on, you gotta give him, you gotta give the Messiah a little bit of time. You gotta give him a little bit of, you gotta give him a shake a little bit. You gotta give him some time. It took 85 years, 86 years, whatever. Yeah. He wasn't happy with that answer, but okay. But again, why should someone think? And you say Boston sports fans, yeah, they're more stuck up maybe than other people because they always win. A lot of times, over the last 20, 30 years, they've been very successful. Okay. But does that give me the right to put someone down to think I'm better than them because that's where I grew up? Yeah, doesn't give me the right to say anything. right? Being conceited, one of the worst, one of the worst things. How could being conceited not be obvious? That would be my question. How is that not obvious? I think it's pretty obvious. Should be pretty obvious. Yeah. That's what I would say. Somebody asks, we're not obligated yet, but we are learning. Right. You're not obligated. 100% you're not obligated. Right. But the only way you're going to do it is to practice it. That's it. And you make all the mistakes now. I give everyone a blessing. You make all the mistakes now. Once you become a Jew, you don't make any mistakes. Right? And you shine in God's eyes. It's a big thing. So you shouldn't make mistakes. But sometimes you can make mistakes anyway because you don't think and you're busy and whatever. Right? But, you got to do that. Somebody asked, did Esau marry Ishmael's daughter? Yes. Well, he married one of his daughters, yeah. Married one of his daughters. Married someone else also. Married the daughter of a Hittite, I think, also, which is why Rivka and Yitzchak sent Yaakov to Lavan, right? Because it bothered them that he was married to a Hittite woman, even though he married the daughter of Ishmael also, right? Which is kind of interesting because we know all about Lavan and how bad he was. So they thought going back to family, even if he was bad and a crook and all this, it was still better than going to other people in other nations. Torah shows that's the pedigree. Okay, but I'll give you an example. A secular Jew who thinks they're better than a non-Jew. What makes them any better? They don't keep Torah mitzvahs. And nobody says we're better, by the way. We're better than a non-Jew because I eat gefilte fish. Because I put my apple in my honey. Right? Jews have obligations. We're chosen. That means we're stuck up. Doesn't mean that. We have more obligations. God went to all the nations. None of the nations wanted the Torah. So God came to the Jewish people and said, you want the Torah? They said, yeah. They say, you want to know what's written in it? They said, no, we don't care. Not seven Ishmael. We're going to do, and we'll hear whatever it's all about. That's it. Right? It's not about being better. People make it sound like that, but, anyone wants to take on my obligations, what I have to do, good, let them take it on. Right? But they didn't want the Torah. None of the nations wanted the Torah. Okay. But if a secular Jew thinks, being Jewish is like this great, society to be part of or whatever, we're not going to hang out with non-Jews, we're not going to speak to non-Jews and this and that. Forget about intermarriage and other things because we don't hang out with Jews. That's being stuck up. Right? That is being stuck up. Thinking they're better based on what? You go to their schools, you watch their movies, you go to their ball games, you eat their food, so what makes you any different? Right? I'm not going to say better, different. What differentiates you? Nothing. Nothing. The only thing differentiates us between Jews and non-Jews is the Torah we keep. That's it. Right? But that doesn't make us better. Does not make us better. Someone here says rivalry makes zero winners. Rivalry is fun. Come on. Remember going to Celtics game screaming out, beat LA and we hate LA and all that. Yeah. So, it's all part of the thing. Yeah. Does it mean anything? No. Doesn't mean anything. Right? Doesn't mean anything. What is a Hittite? A Hittite is one of the seven nations that the Jews were obligated to obliterate out from the land of Israel. Hittites, what are the oops, one second. You have Hittites, okay, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Right? So Hittites are part of those seven nations that the Jewish people had an obligation to wipe out going in when they went into the land. Now we don't know who any of them are today anyway, because all the nations got mixed up with Sancheir mixed up all the nations, so we don't even know who they are. They're all, none of these nations exist anymore, but the obligation was to drive them out of the land because of all the terrible things that, all the terrible characteristics that they have. So it's an obligation to get rid of them. So the Jews were chosen between the Egyptians and the Hebrews. No. Gemara says God went to all the nations. Went to Esav, went to Ishmael, right? Asked them different questions, and they said, no, we don't want, we don't want the Torah. What's written in it? We don't. Oh, if there's written in it, we don't want it. So God went to all the nations. That's what the Gemara says. God went to all the nations. It wasn't just the Egyptians. It went to all the nations. Medrash says the same thing. Yeah, went to all the nations, and all the nations rejected it. It wasn't just one nation. God didn't just go to the Egyptians and say, okay, you want the Torah? They say no, so he gave it to the Jews. It went to all the nations. That's what the Gemara says very clearly. Someone says of the Hebrews having nothing coming out of Egypt. What did they have? What did they have coming out of Egypt? Nothing. But God made them into a nation and gave them the Torah, Mount Sinai. Right? So, grabbing whatever God is offering, how could that go wrong? How could that go wrong? What happened after Jewish people got the Torah, Mount Sinai? Right? We just read about it a few weeks ago. It's called Sin of the Golden Calf. God says, if I dwell amongst the Jewish people, I'm going to wipe out the entire nation. Right? Moshe intervenes. And God says, I'll make a nation out of you. No. You could have wiped out the entire nation. Now look at Jewish history. Look at Jewish history. Jewish history has been a disaster in a lot of ways. We had the first temple, second temple, very good. We had a lot of power at one time. Look at everything that's happened to Jewish people, the last 2,000 years. Pogroms, Holocaust, and even worse, spiritually, intermarriage. Yeah. So we haven't had it easy. What could go wrong? Okay, we're at the top of our game in so many different things, so many different areas, in science and medicine and, all kinds of things. Okay. But again, what's our obligation? Our obligation is to keep what God says. And if you don't keep what God says, there's payback. So you want to ask me what could go wrong? Why did the other nations not want it? It's a different question, right? So we'll give an example. God goes to Esav, and he asks Esav, he said, you want the Torah? He says, what's written in it? He says, you can't kill, right? Don't kill. So he says, what do you mean? It says, I'm supposed to live by the sword. Not interested. God goes to Ishmael. It says to Ishmael, you want the Torah. It says, what does it say? Don't steal. So what does Ishmael say? He says, wait a minute. It says I'm a per Adam, right? I'm a wild man. My hand's in the hands of everyone. Everyone's in the hands of me. I got what we call sticky fingers. I steal for a living. That's what Ishmael is. That's what they do. In general, that's what they do. Yeah, that's part of their nature. Okay. So they say, no, we're not interested. Right? So then God goes to all the other nations. Doesn't say what they answered. Just says he went to all the other nations. They all rejected and came to the Jewish people. But you say, what could go wrong? Look at Jewish history. Look how many people have been slaughtered. Look how many people have been annihilated. Oh, look how many, cities and whatever where Jews were. Gonzo. Well, Jews are gone. How many people, killed in Poland and Nebuchadnezzar did and all these things, But, we still have to keep the Torah regardless of whether we understand it, better or not. We have to keep it. Right? So the difference is we keep Torah, right? Right. But that, again, that's the difference. But if a person's going to say, I'm better as a Jew than a non-Jew just because I'm a Jew, but I don't keep Torah mitzvahs, that means nothing. Right? That is being conceited. That 100% is like a club to join. Right? So we're better because, I have that pedigree, I'm a Jew. Yeah, so that's a problem. That is a problem. At the time of the giving of the Torah, before the Torah was given, we're talking about before the Torah was given. God went to all the nations. When the Jewish people came and said, we want to keep the Torah, so later they got the Torah. Right? Later they got the Torah. The Gemara makes very clear in the Avodah Zarah, tractate of Avodah Zarah 2b to 3a, makes it very, very clear that God went to all the nations. It doesn't say what all the nations, in every single nation, what the question was and what they answered. But they all rejected it. That's what the Gemara says. They all rejected, but it says very clearly, very, very clearly, God went to all the nations. Right? The only nation that wanted to accept it was the Jews. Right? They had okay. One second. Why is it a sin? Why is it sin for no eyes to pull out the plug of someone in a coma and it's not obvious? So let me ask you. I would say like this. Um, what's their claim? What's their claim? They're claiming I'm saving the person. They're claiming it's mercy, right? They're claiming it's mercy. Now, they're part of a society, right? They're part of a society in the general society that does not give honor to human life. So if they're part of a society that does not give honor to human life, and it's all about, what doctors think quality of life is. Yeah. They say the person, won't be able to walk as good. No, whatever, they're suffering. They say, this is not quality of life, so to speak. The story of someone who is basically suffering from cancer. And this woman tells the story as her mother. And this hospital just wanted her to go to hospice and die. Yeah, tried to convince her. Brought in palliative care and tried to convince her. So her primary care doctor said, listen, if you don't get her out of that hospital, they're going to kill her. Like, she's going to die. Yeah, so she got transferred, got her out of the hospital, went to another hospital. She lived another 10 years. Another 10 years. She would have been dead in like 2 months. Not even. Not even. So why they do that? Because they're claiming that that's quality of life. You're not going to have quality of life. So we're going to put you out to pasture. Yeah, we're going to put you out to pasture, right? So they're on. Again, there are cases where a person could take someone off a respirator. It's not called murder, right? But a case where it is murder, they're claiming that's mercy, right? But that's based on a society that's totally cracked about what quality of life is called. So therefore pulling the plug, again, they have a whole idea of what they think life is. Yeah. So therefore, since they're wrong, and they're dead wrong, no pun intended, they're totally wrong. And they say, oh, that's quality of life. Right? You don't have quality of life? Let's pull the plug. Why isn't that obvious? Because they live in a cracked society that's brainwashed them. Now, can someone come out of that brainwashing? Sure. 100% they can come out of that brainwashing. Right? But you got a lot of people in society totally brainwashed. Yeah. I went to, a funeral, visited, somebody mourner's house where, daughter, they were Jewish. So daughter says, father was suffering, couldn't see him suffer anymore. Right? So they cut off the pacemaker. That's murder. Now, what was their intention? Their intention was altruistic. Their intention is they're suffering. Okay. But who says you're allowed to play God over here? Who says you're allowed to play God? I know what quality of life is. It's not a question of quality of life. That's not the issue. Right? The issue is they're alive. And you're hastening their death. Right? They can claim whatever they want. They can say, oh, that's mercy. We don't want to see this person suffer. I get it. Nobody wants to see a loved one suffer. Okay. Well, does that mean they have the right to pull the plug? Because that's not obvious. According to who? According to secular society, maybe it's not obvious. Right? But God gave everyone a brain. God gave everyone a brain to come to Torah mitzvahs. Whether they convert or not, doesn't matter. So if God gave everyone a brain to do that, yeah, then some people are going to say, well, this is wrong. They're going to come to that conclusion. Right? How are they going to come to that conclusion? Because they're going to think. They're going to use their brain and maximize the 3% that they use. And they're going to come to the conclusion that this is wrong. And what society does is wrong. That's what they're going to do. Now, will a lot of people see it? No. That's more obvious. Right? That is more obvious. What news services from Israel are good? Get news on the war. So you go to Arad Sheva, Israel National News, or Yeshiva World News. Those are pretty good. Those are pretty good. Get information. Someone says, I heard from a rabbi that Jews will never serve Ishmael's descendants. Right. Yeah. Did the Rambam serve Arabs and other Jews in the Ottoman Empire? He worked for the king. Yeah. He worked for the king. Okay. He had a job. He worked for the king. That's why he couldn't leave. Right. But it is interesting. Throughout history, Jews living in Arab countries, you always had Arabs working for Jews and not the other way around. Like cleaning houses, doing other things. You never had it the other way around. You never had the other way around. Right? But okay, if a person has a job, and your boss is an Arab, okay. So what? That doesn't change anything, right? We're talking about, maybe more menial things, right? Working for someone else, okay. You can have an Arab that's the boss. You live in an Arab country, that probably a lot more Arabs than Jews living there. Okay, right? But that's not a contradiction, right? It's certainly not a contradiction to that. So the Gemara was written before the Torah was given at the same time. Yeah, it was given at the same time because you need a running commentary at the same time the Torah is given. So the simple answer is Moshe Rabbeinu was teaching the Jewish people for 38 years in the desert. Right? How long would it take to learn 613 commandments? Let's say he trained, I don't know, 3,000 people, 5,000 people. And he went through them soup to nuts, all the laws of the Torah. Right? How long would it take, let's say, 2 to 3 million people in the desert? Let's say 3 million people. How long would it take to teach 3 million people 613 commandments? 5 years? 10 years? 15 years? How long would it take if you have enough teachers? Shouldn't take you more than 20 years. Shouldn't take you 15 years, I wouldn't think. So what's he teaching them? He has to be teaching them oral law. He has to be teaching them the how we're supposed to do things. Because otherwise doesn't make any sense. Why did you take that long? Right? So technically speaking, yes, oral law was given at the same time. Even though you tell me the rabbis came later and they came centuries later, and thousands of years later, okay. But he was teaching, their future teachings on what's going to be and what the Torah is supposed to be and how we're supposed to keep it. It was given at the same time. Because otherwise, if you don't have a working commentary, no one would know what to do. No one would know how to do it. Right? So it wasn't written before the Torah, it was given at the same time. Right? It wasn't before. It was given at the same time. It's really a verse in the Talmud that says, kill the best of the Gentiles. Maybe. I would say there is. Right? Let's say there is. Yeah. Don't you think, if that would be the case, if it would be true, then there has to be context. You can't just say kill, kill all Gentiles or kill the best of them. Obviously, there has to be a context, right? I'll give one example. The Gemara says you're not allowed to save a non-Jew if they're drowning on Shabbos. Now, that's not what the practical law is, but that's what the Gemara says. So people say, see, we hate non-Jews. We wouldn't save them if they were driving, if they were drowning. Yeah, we wouldn't save them. That's not what the halakha is, but that's what the Gemara says. Very good. So anti-Semites and Messianics and all of them will take this out of context and say, see, Jews hate non-Jews. They won't save them on Shabbos. Right? Now, if you look at that Gemara, that's like one line in about 40 lines of the Gemara. Right? The other 39 lines there are talking about that if a Jew is drowning on Shabbos, how do you save him? Why would you not save him? Because the only reason you're going to save him is because he's going to keep future Shabbos. What if he doesn't keep future Shabbos? What if they said you're a Jew? Can I save him on Shabbos? You say maybe he'll get inspired. If an Orthodox Jew saved him, maybe he'll get inspired and want to keep Shabbos. Maybe. Yeah, but you're not allowed to. Right? Technically speaking, that's not the halacha. It doesn't matter. Right? What the Gemara says, that's the context. The context is that the only reason you're going to save a Jew is because you're going to keep Shabbos in the future. Yeah. So now the question is going to be, okay, back and forth. If that's the case, okay. Then at the end, the Gemara says, what about non-Jew? Non-Jew's he's not in the parsha over here. He has nothing to do with Shabbos. So if the non-Jew has nothing to do with Shabbos, you can't save him. Again, that's not the halakha, but you don't save him, right? Now, all the anti-Semites, they see, you don't save non-Jews. That wasn't the question, right? A non-Jew is drawn on Shabbos, you don't save him. That wasn't the question. That wasn't the main question. That was just thrown in afterwards. In the context that that someone doesn't keep Shabbos, you don't save him. They're drowning on Shabbos, right? For a Jew, wasn't a question. Tell me you're not allowed to save the non-Jew. That wasn't the question. The question is how are you allowed to save the Jew? That's the question. That was the question. Now you see, all you have to do is check this online, and people say, "See, Jews hate non-Jews. Don't have to save them on Shabbos." But that was never the question. That's called cherry picking. That's cherry picking your answer, right? Or, cherry picking, let's say better, your statement while taking it totally out of context, right? So even if that would be true, that says the best of Gentiles. Why? Why? Let's say the best of Gentiles. Then you get the nicest guy in the world, and he's Ovdei Avodah Zarah, right? And he's sitting bowing down to cows, or they're a Hindu or a Buddhist or who knows what. What's the obligation? You kill them. It's death penalty, right? For Noah, it's death penalty. For Jews, it's death penalty, right? You kill them. They could be the nicest person in the world. They could be a great doctor. They could be, I don't know, a great, actuary. They could be a great lawyer. Who knows? They could be someone high food person in society. Very good. Yeah, very good. Guess what? Death penalty. They can be the best people, death penalty. Depends on the context. Depends on the context what it is, right? And this happens all the time. That's why, I'm going to harp on this for a second, because people make statements and they say, see, look, Jews hate non-Jews. See, Jews, compare, non-Jews, to this, that, and the other thing. Or I'll give another example. Another example is if a non-Jew ox gores your ox, he has to pay. You gore their ox, your ox gores their ox, you don't have to pay. You say, see? It's not fair. Why does a non-Jew have to pay and a Jew doesn't have to pay? Right? Right? So that's one of the answers. One of the answers is because non-Jews didn't keep the Noahide laws properly. So it's a penalty. They're getting a penalty. Yeah? We're not saying that you should do it on purpose. That he did it by accident. Did it by accident. So technically you don't have to pay. Why? Because they never kept the Noahide laws properly. Laws between man and man, they didn't keep properly. So their money is hefker. Their money is onerous. That doesn't mean you can steal from them. Right? There are a lot of ramifications for this, but that's not the point. So you look at that and say, see, it's permissible. First of all, it doesn't say it's permissible. First of all, it says, if he did it, okay. He didn't do it, first of all, I don't say permissible. He didn't do it on purpose. Yeah. But there are reasons behind it. You might not like the reason. Okay, it might not be the only reason. It could be 10 reasons why. One doesn't give all the reasons. Usually doesn't give, all the opinions. Maybe he'll give a few opinions. Okay. But a person can say, I don't like that reason. I don't like this reason. Yeah. But if you take it out of context, you don't see what the context is, then you can say, we're racist, and we hate non-Jews, and we hate this, and we hate that. Yeah, you can make that statement, but it's not true. You got to see it in context. Yeah, nobody wants to hear that because, all these things make us look bad. Yeah, totally make us look bad. Okay, but what's it talking about? Right? What's it talking about? It could be one aspect of one thing, or it could be they're getting punished for certain things. So that's why the law's like this or like that. Right? But again, someone's going to cherry pick and someone's going to say, this makes us look bad. It does. Right? But you have to understand what the context is. If you don't understand what the context is, right, then, no answer's gonna help. A person can say, I don't like that answer. I don't like that answer. I think this is racist. I think this, I think that. Yeah, I'll take a few other questions here. Yisrael told Moshe to divide the load, right? Told how he did it, okay. Right. So, too many people were asking him questions, so he made other people into judges and to give people information. Good. right? But again, that's not going to take 38 years to go through 613 commandments. So absolutely no falsehoods in the Gemara. There are certain things. Let's say they gave certain. What's the word? They gave, let's say, certain remedies for things. If this happens, you take this. If this happens, you take that. Right? And let's say today the remedies don't work. Right? So they say, oh, see, they know that much about medicine. No, it doesn't mean they know anything about medicine. It could be that the remedy today doesn't work. That time it worked. That time certain medicinal properties worked. There are certain things that things could have changed, and therefore what they said at the time was true, but it doesn't apply. It doesn't apply today. Like one example is by laws of kashrus, something that's sharp, right? If you take a knife, let's say a meat knife, even if it's been used within 24 hours, you cut an onion. Onion is something sharp, right? So that onion cannot be used with dairy, right? We have an axiomatic principle. The knife has been used with 24 hours, so the taste is stale. Yeah, but that only applies if it doesn't come in contact with something that is sharp, right? And an onion is sharp, right? So certain things that are considered that the Gemara says is sharp. Yeah, that if you cut a knife with it, you can't use it. Let's say a meat knife, you can't use it for dairy, or vice versa. The Gemara says something that is sharp is a cucumber. Now, today, most people say cucumbers are not sharp. The only reason they might be sharp is if they're going off, they're sour. And then you're not going to eat them, right? So in that case, that might have changed. Cucumbers might have actually changed. It could be back in time when they were sharp. Today, they're not sharp, right? So certain things could have changed, right? They could have changed, right? Now, it could be also on certain information, that the rabbis had, maybe wasn't totally accurate. They could make mistakes because they didn't have accurate information in front of them. Also, right? They could have made a mistake that way, right? As well. There are certain there are certain things that people point out, say that they did make mistakes in certain things in science. Right? Moshe Meisman, they should be well. It's the head of the Shiva Torah Moshe, which they call Tomo. He was a they worked for many years, with his uncle Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, of blessed memory, one of Torah giants, no question, of the last generation. So he actually taught math. He taught math at MIT. I mean, whatever. It's very, very bright, right? Let's just say. And he wrote a book. I forget what it's called, but he wrote a book basically answering any of these questions in science that want to put the rabbis down and say, oh, they know what they're talking about, and they made mistakes and all this. So he answered them all, right? He answered a lot of them anyway, right? But again, some things could be based on information they had, which might have been bad information, right? So they're not totally infallible. I mean, they can't make mistakes. Doesn't mean they can't make mistakes, per se. But we hold by the wisdom that they gave us. Yeah. Yeah, we hold by that wisdom, and that wisdom today is just as valid as it was 2,000 years ago, even more. Even more. Yeah, 1 second. So there could be certain things. There'll be certain things again, based on information they had at the time, or maybe things changed, right? It depends what it is. It doesn't mean they're not totally infallible, but we listen to what they say, and just about everything when it comes to Jewish law. In general. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, I'm gonna stop here. This every Tuesday and Thursday.
Stay safe, my friend.
Try 10 o'clock Eastern Time, 4 o'clock Israel time, at least for the next week until we change clocks. We'll change the clocks next week, the end of next week. So, anyone has any questions, find me on Facebook at Michael Kaufman, Beyond Orthodox Conversion Judaism, BeyondOrthodoxConversion.com, Beyond Orthodox Conversion Judaism on YouTube. There I got videos, Q&As, ethics for our fathers, Book of Leviticus. Want to send me an email? Rabbi Chaim Kaufman at gmail.com, RBBI, CHIMCOFFMAN at gmail.com, whichever good.